Greetings and welcome back. In this video, I'd like to take a look at bringing in, and technically I guess not even bringing in, but we're going to take a look at some exterior assets that were designed inside of Maya for use in this level. Now, these are just some polygon models, and I want to kind of throw out a disclaimer right now. This is not a Maya training video, so I'm not going to go down the path of showing you how to model and how to texture and all those other things in Maya. What I really want to do is show you these assets in Maya to show you that that's kind of where they were built. Give you a quick rundown of some of the important things to keep in mind when creating your own assets, whether or not you are in Maya, because you can use a lot of different modeling tools to create assets for Unity. You're not restricted to Maya, of course. Anything that supports FBX can export out to Unity. So what I'm going to do is jump on over to Maya, which I already have open and waiting for us. And here we are inside of our scene, and this is our campground. Now, as I said earlier, I don't want to get into modeling, I don't want to get into texturing, but if I select each one of these, you can see that the modeling process, as long as you're even remotely familiar with modeling, is very easy. If you're completely unfamiliar with modeling and the prospect terrifies you, please keep in mind that over on 3D Buzz we have a variety of fantastic training videos that can get you up to this level and way beyond, and many of them are free and ready to go. So this is several different models, and most of them are really basic. You can see here it's really just some blocks. We got some little rocks and a little campfire area that we can put a particle system into a little bit later. But the important thing I wanted to show here was, one, how the textures are actually laid out so that we, this is not a whole bunch of different materials. This is one material and one texture that's been applied to everything, and I'll show you that in a moment. And I wanted to make sure that I got across the problem of scale, which is an interesting issue, at least when working in Maya, because Maya's default unit is centimeters. And so if you're going to be working and sending stuff over to Unity, you really need to be switching that over to meters and making sure that all of your settings are taking meters into account. By default, Unity is going to try to scale everything down to 1/100th of its original size, which is something we're already going to have to combat, even with setting our settings over to meters. That's something we're going to take a look at. But if you leave everything at centimeters, things get really small. Extremely tiny. So how do you change things over into meters? Now, granted, I realize this isn't a Maya training video, but I thought I'd point it out anyway. Let's go under Window, Settings, Preferences, and go over to Preferences. And under the Settings area, make sure that your working units linear is set to the meter, and then just save that. Now, another thing, and maybe this has already crossed your mind, but our grid is set up such that each grid space is 1 meter. Now think about that for a minute. That means that our campfire is almost 3 meters wide. That'd be a big fire. Our benches are, what, about 4 meters wide?
And about 1.5 meters tall.
Yeah, but I mean, really, you'd have to just climb up or get a step stool to even get on that thing. And then if you take a look at our tent, it's about 7 meters deep, so it's about 20 feet, give or take. I mean, it's a huge tent. Everything is oversized here, and you might be wondering why. The default character controller that we are using has an eye level height that is 2 meters tall,
which is about 6.5 feet in height, which means this guy in actuality is probably 7 foot.
Yeah, at least 7 feet tall, because you're talking 6.5 feet just to eye level. So everything is going to appear quite small if you build at life-size standard using meters. So if you decided, well, my tent needs to be about 4 meters deep, and you set that up, things are going to feel quite a bit tinier than you expected once you get over there, if you are using the default character controller that we're using. Now, what we did, or what I did really when I was designing these, is I just bulked everything up. I sized everything up to twice what I'd originally designed it to be, and that seemed to work out pretty well. If you are creating your own game, in most cases, you won't have to do that because you're probably going to end up creating your own character controller in the first place. And that character controller will have its eye level at a slightly more realistic height. That said, we can, if we so desire, we could change the eye level height of the character controller that came along. We could move its eye level down to something a bit more reasonable. I didn't do that here. I just stuck with the default settings and then sized everything up appropriately. You can approach the problem in either direction. I just thought I'd go ahead and mention that. Okay, so there is our tent area. Now let's take a look at the texturing real quick. I'm going to go under Window and open up the UV texture editor. And here you can see the texture that's applied to everything. Obviously the tent is pretty easy to make out. And over here down in the corner, let me just deselect everything. We have to have something selected. We have the texture layout for all of the rocks that go around the campfire. We have the layout for each of the pieces of wood that are inside the campfire. And this is not the world's best layout for game design. I'll be the first to admit that. This is just something I put together that had some nice spacing and was really, really easy to read, which makes it a lot easier to demonstrate when you're doing a training video. So we have kind of a wood texture with some ember, kind of burnt areas. And then we have the base of the campfire itself, which is just kind of like an ash-colored area. And, of course, here's the plank that makes up the bench. And there's the supports that hold the bench up. All of that is stuck on one great big texture. And then all of the various pieces that make up the campground have had their UVs laid out so that they all fit into that one texture and correspond with one another.
As a side note, this is a good practice for optimizing your assets. The fewer textures that you can manage to get all of your meshes to use is going to yield you performance increases in your game when it's actually running. You could take it a step further than we've got here and take all of these assets and combine them into a single mesh and export it as a single mesh with a single texture. What will happen in Unity is it will then take all of that information and render it in a single draw call. These are all more advanced topics, but there are things that when you start getting into designing your assets, you want to read the documentation a little bit closer and be aware of.
And it's good to hear these terms like draw calls and that sort of thing early on, so that later on, once you actually get to learn what they are, their importance, and how to optimize for them, you'll at least be familiar in that you will have heard them once or twice in the past. Now, in my particular case, I had started off combining everything together into a single mesh. I then later separated things out, some of them anyway. The campfire, all the different pieces of the campfire, the logs and the stones, all of this is one mesh. The benches, even though they are three separate meshes, one for each support and then the plank, those have been combined together. And then the tent is its own thing. And the reason I left it like this is so that later on in Unity, once we bring it in, if you want to scoot the benches around, you want to move the tent over here, scoot the campfire, you can do all of that. You can even duplicate things. If we decided we want another bench, we could easily duplicate out another bench or have a second campfire. And that's easy to do, which we'd lose that ability if we were to combine everything into a single polygon mesh.
Right.
So it's kind of a trade-off, but you think about how you want to do it. If you knew in advance that this is exactly the layout you wanted to use and that wasn't going to change, absolutely it'd be a great idea to go ahead and condense everything down to a single polygon mesh. All right, so we've talked about scale. We've taken a look at the texturing. Now let's go ahead and get this exported out. Just going to drag my mouse across everything, make sure it's all selected. We'll go to File, Export Selection. And we're going to make sure that FBX is selected. Now you'll notice I've already got these guys exported out, which is no big deal. We can just overwrite them. So we'll select Camp, click Export, and it already exists, which is fine. Now, in the Include section underneath our FBX exporter, we'll go ahead and leave edge smoothing on. I'm going to uncheck animation because none of this stuff is animated anyway. I'm going to make sure embed media is checked. Now embed media is going to make sure that all of the textures we used are embedded into the FBX and they come along with it. And finally, we have our units, and we can you can see our scale factor here is currently set to 1. File units converted to meters. They already are meters, so the scale factor is currently set to 1. When Unity gets its hands on this file, by default, it's going to divide that number by 100. So if we want it to come in at this size, we need to make sure this scale factor goes up to 100, because 100 divided by 100 is, of course, 1. So we take our file units converted to, bring this back down to centimeters, and our scale factor jumps up to 100. Now I'm going to set this here for the campsite. And later on, I've got another mesh we're about to take a look at, and for that one, I will actually leave it at meters, and we'll see what happens when you do that. So let's go ahead and click Export. Give that just a second. And there we go. So we now have our campsite exported out. Now let's take a look at our other model for our little mine tunnel scary looking thing. And sure, we can save changes, it won't matter. And here is our other object, a little chain link fenced area with a really scary concrete tunnel, and it says facility quarantined, and it's all spooky and scary looking. We're just going to take this and plug it into the side of the mountain and let it sit there and be all ominous. Now, a couple of important points about how this was built. Once again, we were working in meters, just like we were before, and once again, we took everything and sort of bulked it up by a certain percentage just to make it feel a little bit bigger because of the oversized nature of our character controller. Another thing that is important is that I have a material here which is using transparency. And that's kind of an interesting thing inside of Unity because while we're in Maya, we can see a polygon from both sides. We can see the front of it and we can see the back of it. In Unity, we can really only see one side of the polygon. The other side disappears. It won't render. So what I've done here is with this chain link, or this section of chain link fence, is actually made of two parts, which I'll go ahead and separate just to show you. We have one side which points out from here and another side which points inward. So that if we're standing, say here, looking through the fence, we'll be able to see some sort of fence on the inside. If you don't do that, then if you're looking at the back side of the polygon that makes up that chain link fence, it'll look like there's no fencing. All you'll see is the frame. So we had to have two separate polygons. And the trick to that was really just taking the one, duplicating it, and I did that with a Control D if you need to know, slide the two apart, and then rotate the duplicate 180 degrees around so that its normal faces outward. And then the two are just sandwiched right on top of each other. Now I'm going to tap Z a few times and get this guy right back where he belongs. That's why you actually look like you see twice as much fencing here. Because, well, you do. We have these two surfaces that are brushed right up against each other. You don't have to worry about the fact that the textures aren't lining up perfectly, because if you see one side of the fence, you can't see the other. So the fact that they're off their alignment by a little bit doesn't really matter. You can't really tell anyway. So that is all of the critical stuff. The only other thing I will mention is that the way we did the UVs for this is a little interesting. Let me point that out to you. If we grab our tunnel and go under Window, jump over to the UV texture editor, you'll see that we only really used the bottom of the texture area, and then the frame for the fence pretty much takes up this swath right about the middle. Then, if we take a look at the fence, we have an entirely separate texture, but it's using the upper half of our texture area. Now, we didn't really have to do this. The very first time that I had laid out the UVs, I had fully intended to go ahead and just use one great big texture, but I needed to tile my fencing a lot more to get a lot more detail out of it. So I have done what you see here, where I'm really just using the widest texture space that I can that still leaves that fencing at a 1-to-1 ratio. So, I mean, really, that's the exact same shape of that section of fencing just transferred right here. Now, if you select everything together, it conveniently fits all into one texture space, but that really doesn't mean anything because we're going to end up putting a separate texture onto each one. But I'm just pointing that out. If I was doing this all over again and I was really concerned about making the most of my texture space, I would find some other object that I could bring in that could use the rest of this texture space and apply and put the textures for that up in here because it's just wasted area right now. Or I would just reconsider the entire texture process to just take up a lot more of this zone. Anyway, I just thought I'd kind of throw that out there, but for purposes of demonstration, it doesn't really matter too much. So let's go ahead and close this. And we can export this out too. Now, do you think we should go ahead and export this out at full size too?
No, let's show them what will happen if you don't hit the right setting and we leave it out as meters.
All right, so let's go ahead with everything selected. We'll go to Export Selected, and we'll click on the tunnel. And yes, we want to overwrite that. And let's see, we don't really need animation. We do want to embed media, and we're going to leave our scale factor set to 1.
So remember, Unity is going to want to reduce everything by a factor of 100.
That's right. So it's going to basically divide it all by 100 once it gets in. Let's go ahead and click Export, and there we go. So now everything went through just fine.
Do you want to explain the Place 2D tiling of the textures?
That's actually, yeah, let's do that before we jump out of Maya, because I did almost forget. I tried to remind myself right before I was going to talk about the double-sided aspect of the fence, and then I totally forgot, so thanks. The tiling of these textures is kind of interesting. If I select this little section of the chain link fence here and go over to the fence material here inside the attribute editor, and we go over to the texture that's driving the color, watch what happens if I click to view this texture. It's just a really small section of texture. In fact, I think I pulled this off of the Filter Forge website, if you wanted to grab one yourself to play with. And you'll see that really it's not repeating anywhere near the number of times needed to give us the great big hunk of fencing that we're using right now. So obviously we had to tile it. Now to show you how that is working, I'm going to go over to Rendering Editors under the Window menu and jump down to Hypershade. And let's see here, if I show both the top and bottom tabs, hold down the right mouse button over the fence material and graph out the network using the marking menu, then I'm just going to show the work area, the bottom tabs only. What I've done is I've taken one place 2D texture node and I'm using it to drive both the bump texture and the diffuse texture, so that I only have to change one setting and everything kind of updates. But the important thing that I was trying to get across is here are the numbers that I'm using for repetition. We're repeating 25 times in the U direction and 20 times in the V direction. And that's really just because to me the texture looked a little bit too wide, and by tiling a few more times horizontally it just lines up a little bit better. But I mean, of course you could tweak to your own satisfaction. The reason I'm pointing this out here is that tiling is not in the texture itself. It's here inside the Place 2D texture node, and the Place 2D texture node is not going to come with us. So Unity will have no idea how to tile these textures. So we need to remember that so we can apply it in Unity later on. So with that said, we have everything exported out. We've taken a look at not so much the modeling process, but we did kind of take a look at some considerations for modeling. Make sure that your units are set to meters because it will make things easier. If you're using the default first-person controller, bulk everything up by a little bit. We averaged about an extra 100%, so basically double the size of everything, just to make it seem about the right height. I mean, of course, you can tweak the first-person controller that comes with Unity. We just didn't do that. We've taken a look at the export settings. We've mentioned that Unity is going to take the scale factor of your model and divide it by 100 when it comes in, which we'll see more of that later and show how to compensate for it. But I can't think of anything else to mention here.
I think that's it for this one.
All right, so that's going to wrap up this video. Now, in the next video, we're not going to be in Maya anymore. We're going to be back over inside of Unity, and we'll show how to get these objects from the FBX files that we just outputted into Unity and work with them. Just one more thing I'll reiterate is just because we showed Maya here doesn't mean you have to follow along or do this kind of thing with Maya. You can use any modeling package that supports the FBX format. As long as you have access to FBX, you can get things straight into Unity. But that is going to wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot.